Welcome to the second day of the CME, where we promise you all a day of feast, a feast of knowledge. Yesterday, we had a great and interactive academic session, which was appreciated by one and all. We hope that today's session would also capture your interest. Without further ado, I would like to begin the first session of the CME on portal biliopathy. I request the honored chairpersons to kindly take their seats. It is my pleasure to invite Dr. T.K. Chattopadhyay, Professor and Head of Department, Hepatobiliary Surgery, ILBS New Delhi, and former Head of Department of GI Surgery AIIMS, former President IASG. Dr. S.P. Kaushik, former Professor and Head of Department of Surgical Gastroenterology, SGPGI, Lucknow. Dr. Rajiv Sharma, Professor, Department of General Surgery, GMCH, Chandigarh. I request the chairpersons to introduce the speaker. I request the speakers to stick to the time limit. Questions for discussion will be taken at the end of the session.
Rathi, Associate Professor of Nephrology.
Has been changed to accommodate me. Actually, 1 or 2 years back when there was a certificate course, then I delivered this talk right here, and then this was appreciated as per feedback by Dr. Yadav, and then he requested me to deliver a similar kind of talk to all of you. So the talk is prevention and management of acute kidney injury in case of surgical obstructive jaundice. And some of you might be wondering that what this topic is doing here among the surgeon, and all the surgical complications are being dealt with and you are being taught how to do surgery. So here this is for you, is that acute kidney injury is quite common in cases of surgical obstructive jaundice. And you can see in any typical case of general surgery, the AKI occurs in around 1% of cases. But when the case is of surgical obstructive jaundice, the incidence increases to as high as 10 to 15%. Whenever AKI occurs, it increases both the ICU as well as hospital stay, and it is associated with increased risk of death. So as high as 50 to 75% of surgical obstructive jaundice patients who die have actually AKI in their body. And this is the summary of table which was published and which was reviewed way back in 1995, and if you just concentrate on the last column, that if the mean mortality rate otherwise is around 14%, if patient develops AKI, this 14% increases to as high as 68%, with a mean incidence of AKI of 8%. So this is the significance of AKI for you people, and that is why you have to treat it and manage it. So what is difference between acute renal failure and AKI? Because I am saying again and again AKI, and many of you might not be familiar with this word, because previously ARF was being used, which is defined as development of acute renal failure within hours or days. But now this terminology has been changed from ARF to AKI to denote basically that it is just a continuum of disease and not a one-shot incidence, and it has to be recognized quite early before it actually goes into actual failure. So AKI has been defined recently by increase in serum creatinine of more than or equal to 0.3 mg per deciliter, or increase of more than 1.5 times of baseline, or urine output going down by 0.5 ml per kg per hour for at least 6 hours. So what are the risk factors of developing perioperative AKI in a case of surgical obstructive jaundice? So you have to assess patients even before the actual surgery is being conducted, because there are pre-operative risk factors which increases this AKI injury. And these may be patient related, like pre-existing renal dysfunction, advanced age, any cardiac abnormality, coronary artery disease, diabetes mellitus, patient having pre-existing sepsis or volume depletion, or if patient is on drugs like NSAIDs, antibiotics or radiocontrast media. While actually undergoing the surgery, the risk factor may be again the same, which are the patient related factor: increased anesthesia time, increased surgical time, increased blood loss, patient going into hypotension, patient requiring repeated blood transfusions. These may be the risk factor for AKI. And then post-operatively, whenever the patient is having excessive bleeding and going into hypotension or developing sepsis, patient taking a lot of antibiotics, NSAIDs for the pain, and so on and so forth. So these are the risk factors for developing AKI. So why obstructive jaundice? I have told you that as compared to general surgery patients, the obstructive jaundice patients are at high risk of developing AKI. Why it is so? This is because of three main factors. First is the volume depletion. Because obstructive jaundice patients are usually having a lot of vomitings, they have decreased oral intake, and because of excess of bilirubin and bile salt, they go into salt and water diuresis, and these all factors lead to volume depletion. Second important factor is endotoxemia. So what happens in normal subjects, the endotoxin which is produced by gut flora is then broken down by your bile salts which are present in your gut. But in obstructive jaundice, these bile salts are not going into the duct. So this endotoxin gets accumulated in the duct and subsequently gets absorbed into the blood circulation, and this causes increase in endotoxin presence in the blood. This increased endotoxin presence then leads to variety of manifestations, activation of cytokines, endothelial dysfunction, endothelial injury, hypotension, and things like disseminated intravascular coagulation. So all these parameters then ultimately lead to decrease in organ perfusion and acute kidney injury. Then your hyperbilirubinemia itself can cause acute kidney injury, and studies have shown that obstructive jaundice patients who have bilirubin of more than 30 mg per deciliter have higher chances of going into AKI. And this has been implicated because high bilirubin interferes with the mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, and it causes oxidative damage to the kidney. And it also causes, along with bile salts, increase in the salt and water diuresis. And third important factor is the toxic effect of bile salt itself. Again, it causes salt and water diuresis as well as oxidative damage to the kidney tubules. So this is a flow chart which depicts basically what is going on in a patient of surgical obstructive jaundice, which is ultimately culminating into an increased risk of acute kidney injury, and this basically summarizes the factors which I have already told you. So how to identify whether your patient is going into acute kidney injury or not? First is you will assess which are the high risk patients which will be going into acute kidney injury. And the two most important factors which will tell you that whether your patient is going into AKI or not is the simple urine output and measurement of serum creatinine. These are well established factors and very simple to measure. And there are classification criteria when you define. So previously the classification criteria was summarized in this table, which are known as rifle classification criteria. So this rifle R stands for risk, injury, failure, loss, and end stage. So this is being nominated as rifle. So these were the old classification criteria. The basic difference between old and new, which I'll tell subsequent slide, is that the early identification of this risk. So previously the AKI or ARF was being labeled when the creatinine increased by more than 1.5 times. So if the baseline creatinine is 1, unless it increases to 1.5, you will not label that patient as acute renal failure. However, what is the difference now? The classification criteria which are now being practiced are known as AKI network classification criteria, and they basically divide this AKI into 3 stages, and the basic difference lies in the stage 1. Other stages are similar, and the basic difference is that you now label AKI as high as serum creatinine elevation of more than or equal to 0.3. So a patient of baseline serum creatinine of 1 mg per deciliter, you will label him as AKI at 1.3 rather than 1.5, which you were previously classifying them. So this is the most important, and the reason for this is that we have to identify them early and we have to intervene early in these cases. And other than serum creatinine and urine output, there are variety of biomarkers which have been studied in various kinds of AKI, including perioperative AKI. So what is the importance of biomarkers is that they cause early prediction and diagnosis. They may identify the primary location of injury and predict the outcome as well as recovery. And variety of biomarkers which have been studied in quite greater detail are cystatin C, neutrophil gelatinase associated lipocalin, or which is commonly known as NGAL, KIM1, and FABP. But most of these biomarkers have been studied in cardiopulmonary bypass surgical patient rather than surgical obstructive jaundice patient, and there is no study of these biomarkers in surgical obstructive jaundice patients. So how do you prevent perioperative? So as I have mentioned previously, that you have to have a good preoperative assessment. And not only you should look at just serum creatinine, but you should actually measure by GFR, what is known as estimated GFR, and there are various kind of formulas which are available for calculating this estimated GFR. The one which is most commonly used is known as Cockcroft-Gault formula, and which is shown in the screen on the screen. But other commonly used formula are MDRD equations and CKD EPI equations. So these are all available freely on net as well as available as mobile applications. So you can all download it freely and then just feed creatinine, age, height, and other parameters and weight, and then it will just calculate and give the eGFR for you. And this is very important. And then you will monitor the urine output of this patient, avoid hypotension, hypoxia, try to maintain good organ perfusion, and as well as avoid nephrotoxic drugs and toxins. Now, once you think that this patient is a high-risk candidate for developing AKI, or this patient is actually going into the AKI, then what are the things which you can do? The most important thing which you should do is maintenance of adequate fluid balance, and you should start these patients on fluids. Whether you give oral if the condition of patients permits, or you give it IV, it depends on the condition to condition, and it also depends on the surgeon's choice. Whether you should give colloids or crystalloids, again there is no clear-cut benefit of one kind of fluid over other. You can give colloids or crystalloids, and there is limited evidence that you have to choose one over other. So by and large, the choice of fluid is normal saline, which is followed by colloids if required. But one thing which you should avoid, and which is well documented in literature, is you should not give hydroxyethyl starch to this patient as colloid for fluid replacement, because it has been shown in varieties of studies is giving hydroxyethyl starch actually increases acute kidney injury. And then there are certain studies which have shown that you should give actually bile salt, so that they go into the colon and they act as normal bile salt and break down your endotoxin, and then decreases their absorption into blood circulation. So with this hypothesis, there have been studies which have given bile salts to patients of acute kidney injury in cases of surgical obstructive jaundice. However, the results are very variable, and there are actually studies which show that giving bile salts may be toxic to the patient, and you should avoid giving them. So this is the summary of studies which have been done using bile salt, and if you concentrate on this line, that bile salts are actually detrimental in this study, and currently there is no consensus on giving bile salts in these patients. What about lactulose? So again, on similar phenomena, that lactulose is actually acting as a prebiotic in the gut, and they promotes the gut microflora, and then reduces the endotoxin load in the body. And again, there are studies with no definite conclusion over and above whatever fluid corrections and other things you are doing. Similarly, perioperative dopamine and other things like phenol-dopam and other things have also been studied in various studies. Again, there is not much evidence that you should actually use perioperative low-dose dopamine to increase the renal circulation, and there is no well-defined criteria whether you should use or not use. Now, two most common things which all surgeons, at least in PGI, use commonly are the diuretics. One is mannitol and second is the loop diuretics. Whether or not you should use it. So mannitol you should definitely avoid it, except in cases whenever you want to decrease the intracranial pressure. Why you should avoid mannitol is because it is an osmotic diuretic. It causes damage to the renal tubules. It adds up to already volume depleted state. So you should not use mannitol. And then what about loop diuretics? So this is again the studies which have been done for mannitol, and mannitol causes greater deterioration in renal function as compared to giving no mannitol, so you should avoid giving mannitol. What about loop diuretics? So well, you can give loop diuretics, but again in very selected group of patients, not in all patients. When you have calculated the volume depletion and you have replaced the adequate amount of fluid to the body, and now patient is in well hydration, then and then only you should give loop diuretics. Otherwise you should not give loop diuretics, because it actually again leads into salt and volume diuresis, as well as leading on to volume depletion, and it aggravates the acute kidney injury. So unless your patient warrants diuretic because of the fluid overload stage, you should avoid using them. And this is summary of varieties of whatever you do. So basically what helps is the volume replacement, which is indicated by BL, and other things like giving mannitol, low dose dopamine, bromide, etc. may or may not help to your patient. And these are the KDIGO guidelines for managing any kind of AKI, be it perioperative or simple AKI. So again, they also say that on the basis of evidence-based recommendation, it is only the fluid replacement which matters. Whether you give diuretics or not, whether you give low dose dopamine or not, whether you give phenol-dopam or not, adrenaline diuretic peptide or any recombinant human growth factors, it is all immaterial. It just adds to the cost of the management of the case. So fluid is the only answer. So these are the three lines that you should assess them preoperatively. You should give them adequate hydration, and you should avoid giving them nephrotoxic antibiotics as well as NSAIDs. So this is ultimately a case example for all the residents. sitting over here and practicing surgeons, that how a diligent observation can matter to the patient, how a good resident can matter to the patient. So suppose this is an hypothetical example that a 70-year-old male with a weight of 50 kg and serum creatinine of 1 milligram per deciliter comes to you with any cause of surgical obstructive jaundice. You can put your own cause. And then this patient goes for surgery. Now before going for surgery, you plan that you want to look in detail in his abdomen, and you want to do an contrast CT. So this patient being his serum creatinine of 1 milligram per deciliter, nobody has looked at his estimated GFR. Everybody thinks that this patient is normal. And so this patient undergoes contrast CT. Following contrast CT, this patient undergoes surgery. And because this patient is being labeled as normal renal function, this will be dealt as well as like other cases of surgical obstructive jaundice, and even in post-operative period, you will give him all routine sort of antibiotics and NSAIDs. And thus, this is a typical patient which is a very high-risk candidate for developing perioperative AKI. He is elderly. He is undergoing contrast study, and then subsequently, similar kind of patient is there, but this time there is an intelligent resident. So he looks at him, serum creatinine is 1, I'm finishing in 1 minute only. And again similar cause of surgical obstructive jaundice, but this time the resident has calculated his estimated GFR, and now this estimated GFR by Cockcroft formula comes to 48 ml per minute. Now everybody will be alerted that this patient is having deranged renal function. This patient will still undergo contrast study if it is required for the patient's management, but you will try to reduce the contrast volume, you will try to give osmolar agents, you will give adequate hydration, and you will give anisotretinoin. So you will still undergo CT abdomen, but with all these precautions, when this patient undergoes surgery, you will try to reduce the surgery time, avoid hypotension, and there will be aggressive monitoring during surgery, and in the post-operative operative period, you will give no NSAIDs, you will give appropriate antibiotics, and you will avoid hypotension. And thus, you will significantly reduce the risk of perioperative AKI in this case. So just a diligent observation saves the patient. So to summarize the take-home message, our kidneys are most important organs to bear the brunt of excessive load of bilirubin and bile salts in a case of surgical obstructive jaundice. And thus the development of AKI is very frequent. It just requires a close observation, and adequate hydration, no matter how, which or what fluid and what quantity you want to give, is the most important step in management of AKI. Thank you very much for your patience.
That was a very nice talk, so I must compliment you. I as GI surgeon, I'm very, very scared of the kidney. Pre-operative, generally we don't have any problems. But when I'm operating, maybe a case of obstructive jaundice, whatever the reason might be, my one eye and ear is on what the urine output during the surgery is. That subset of patients in which the urine output during surgery falls, that subset of patients really has a very high mortality that I have observed. It's very difficult to reverse that damage done during surgery. So the anesthetist also has to be very, very aware that the hydration intraoperative and maintaining that urine output during surgery has to be maintained. And any specific, steps that have to be taken in your view during that period, which is usually neglected. We are focusing on pre-operative and post-operative part also, because during surgery it's mainly the anesthetist who is going to be monitoring that. Any specific point you can suggest in that era, in that period of time?
Yeah, your points are very well taken, and this is what I have also mentioned. So the most important step is to identify your high-risk patient in the pre-operative period. That is the most important step. And once you have identified, like I have shown, you calculate his GFR, just not look at his serum creatinine. You will actually identify many more patients who will be on high risk for developing AKI. So that is the most important step. Once you have identified, then actually you will, on your own, will tell your anesthetist that, look, this patient is a high-risk candidate for developing AKI. I want you to maintain good perfusion, good organ perfusion, good hydration, as well as good urine output. So this will go from your side to anesthetist, because anesthetist will again may or may not look at into a greater detail. It is ultimately your responsibility to the patient. So you have to assess and tell the anesthetist. And the maintaining organ perfusion is the only answer to prevent AKI in all the three stages: pre, post, and intraoperative.
Any other question?
16 somewhere.
16 before contrast study, does it really help?
Yeah, it does help because there are many studies which have shown that N-acetylcysteine is of help, and what is most important is it does not cause any damage. So whatever benefit is there, it actually does not cause any harm. And there are also studies including in NEJM which has compared the dose to dose. So giving 1200 milligram is better than giving 600 milligram. So you should give 1.2 grams rather than 0.6 grams. And then second thing is, if your patient has to undergo an emergency contrast study and you can't give oral dose at least 12 hours before, then you should give IP N-acetylcysteine. So it is now recommended by our guidelines that you should give N-acetylcysteine to prevent contrast-induced injury.
What is your advice on the use of inotropes?
Again, the inotrope use is basically that you have to maintain organ perfusion. So as long as you are maintaining organ perfusion by giving whatever inotropes which is being practiced in your center, it is alright for us. So there is nothing like dopamine is better over dobutamine or dobutamine is better over noradrenaline. Whatever you want to give, you can give as long as you are maintaining mean arterial pressure of more than 90 or 100.
I just want to make one statement. I was a resident here. What we used to do here when a case of obstructive jaundice comes to the OPD, from the very first day the patient is here, we used to start him on oral hydration fluids, ORS. So till the time the patient used to be worked up for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, the patient was prescribed कि तुम्हें लेना ही लेना है. So there was actually, we used to reduce the chances that the patient might not be hydrated when the patient used to be admitted. So this is for all those people who are from outside. They can do the same thing with their patients.
Regarding intraoperative hydration, I see two conflicting views. Currently, anesthesia practices low fluids with NORAD at a low dose in order to maintain blood pressure. And on the other hand, we are now talking about giving enough fluids to prevent renal dysfunction intraoperatively. Both are contrary views.
So I can't comment on what anesthetists are doing, but actually I have shown you the evidence, I have shown you the recommendation. So giving low fluid and adding on to IV noradrenaline is not at all evidence based than giving IV fluids alone, if that is maintaining your organ perfusion. If giving IV fluids alone is not maintaining your organ perfusion, then you have to add inotropes. Only then. Otherwise, there is no advantage of giving any sort of inotrope over and above IV fluids. That is what I have shown you. I can't comment on anesthetist practice.
An extension of this, are there problems of over-infusion, over-hydration by the over-enthusiastic anesthetist? That's what we see sometimes, particularly when there is unexpected loss of fluids during surgery, blood and fluids. There is an over-enthusiastic infusion, then the problems of over-hydration.
Yeah, this happens sometimes, and this basically happens because of the poor monitoring of the patient. This happens in PGI also, that we have not monitored that patient adequately. This patient goes into decreased urine output, and suddenly we give lot of fluids and this patient goes into fluid overload. So this basically means that you are not observing this patient carefully. Otherwise, if you are maintaining or observing this patient carefully, you are identifying a hydration or decreased hydration at an early stage, then you will manage them accordingly. But I think this may be avoidable, but not in 100% of cases. This happens in PGI also.
Problems are panic reactions, particularly when unexpected loss occurs.
Is there any relationship between the urine volume and GFR?
Yeah, urine volume and GFR are very
So if
closely
that is the
related.
case, then why do you want GFR estimation?
No, you want GFR estimation at baseline, not during monitoring. At the first step of patient evaluation. Because that time patient will come with normal urine output, because urine output does not go down significantly if the GFR does not go down significantly. So like the example I have given you, you have looked at the serum creatinine of 1, that looks normal. But this patient is 70 years, this patient is at a age of weight of 50 kg. So both, he is in a compromised situation. His GFR is reduced, but he is maintaining normal renal parameters in the blood because of the over-functioning of the kidney. That is why you have to monitor the serum creatinine at the patient evaluation, not subsequently. Subsequently, you will monitor urine output.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Manish, and all the very best.
Okay, so after such a wonderful presentation, now we come to the second lecture, that is on the evidence-based medicine in GB and bile duct, to be delivered by Dr. Kishore G.S. Bharati. TD, you are presenting? Okay, Dr. TD will be presenting on his behalf now.
I'm sorry, sorry to the whole audience and my senior colleagues. Good morning to everybody. Dr. Kishore, who is our alumni and wonderful person working with Professor TPC today, and he used to come together, but his child has been unfortunately admitted in a respiratory unit, so because of the bronchial asthma. So I requested in the night that please send your talk, because I just want this talk for the resident that they should understand. I came from a medical college, so sometimes we knew many things, but what is evidence-based medicine that was lacking at that particular time. So I thought, because our audience is lots of resident, I thought just to summarize the talk, I never wanted to postpone any talk. So I take your due permission for all the dignitaries of the IHBBA. Please excuse me for continuing with this, because this talk has been prepared totally by Dr. Kishore. I am just proxy, please. So he had mentioned that what is the scenario, what are the questions we have to answer, then what is the evidence in the literature, and what is the recommendation. And I was reading, it's a very nicely prepared talk. So evidence-based medicine is an approach to a medical practice intended to optimize decision making by emphasizing the use of evidence from a well-designed and conducted research. So this is what is the evidence-based medicine, and the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of the current best evidence in making decision about the care of a individual patient. So this is what is the evidence-based medicine, and we should get rid of the what I say, you say. So that is what is the, and what is the level of the evidence. So what is the definition of the level of evidence? So level 1 evidence. If you talk, what is level 1 evidence? Is a systemic review, meta-analysis, well-conducted randomized control trials. This is the level 1. Cohort studies are level 2 evidence. Case control studies are level 3 evidence. Case series are level 4 evidence. And level 5 is opinion by experts sitting here. So that is what is the meaning of level evidence. So grade some recommendation. So based on this evidence, grade A recommendation is a strong recommendation, should be followed unless strong compelling rationale for the alternative approach is present. So this is grade A recommendation. There is a difference between evidence and recommendation. Grade B recommendation, recommended, but clinicians should be alert to new development and sensitive to the patient preferences. So this is what is the B recommendation. C recommendation is opinion, should be flexible in the approach. That is very important, and taking into account the patient preferences strongly. And grade D opinion is opinion, all alternatives should be considered. This versus harm for the benefit of the patient. So all these are only to benefit one group, that is the patient. So very nicely depicted that a 40-year-old lady with a symptomatic gallstones meets SR in the OPD or anybody and insists that she should be operated as usually in countries by a consultant only, not the resident. How one would respond to her? So question to answer is, does experience matter in laparoscopic cholecystectomy? Meaning, coming to the straight, is there any difference in the literature when consultant operates or resident operates? So see this is the evidence that no difference in the complication rate, convergence between residents and consultants. So if there is a supervised training, you have today one evidence, all my residents, that if you are supervised, training is supervised, you can say that, look, I can operate and I will not bear more complications than anterior. So this is very important. No difference in the BDI in the hospitals with are without surgical intensive program. This is very alarming. I never knew this one before the reading this. And analysis of so many patients over the 9 years. So this particular thing, but this is what is the evidence. So evidence is if hospitals which are without surgical residency, meaning thereby even without residency program, the hospitals can train their people to the extent that there is no difference in the complications. So only difference in the complications which surgeons experience. Only in acute cholecystitis, I repeatedly explained my views in my talk. History of BRC stenting, Dr. Sinha is sitting here, were associated with higher complications. So, he is my friend, I can talk all this. More than 100 cases have a lesser risk of intraoperative complications. So, these are the important factors. So please remember, today go with this point that more than 100 cases, lesser risk would be there. But I discussed yesterday, more than 200 cases, you might not have the same Swiss database of so many patients. So I thought this talk would be nice. So that dyspnea mitral laparoscopy cholecystectomy, only years. There is no difference in the complication rate when SRs, Gus and 10 performed. This is a level 3 evidence. This is the summary. Experience of more than 100 cases reduces the intraoperative complication rate. Again, level 2 evidence. This is the summary of what I said. I will finish before. A 30-year-old lady from Delhi instantly answered that she might have a gallbladder cancer as a development. This discussion goes in every forum of gallbladder surgery. She also recalls a distant relative who has a similar problem. She had a asymptomatic gallstone, but wants her gallbladder to be removed to eliminate the risk of gallbladder. Sarvaja, Dr. Sadiq was talking yesterday. So meaning thereby, is prophylactic cholecystectomy justified in the areas of gallbladder cancer? We all do because there is a risk. So see the literature. Gallstones are probably a cofactor but do not have a direct etiological role and may be considered in stones more than 3 cm, gallbladder packed with stone, long standing stone, strong family history, not advised for asymptomatic choledysthyrosis. So again, coming to the this porcelain gallbladder prophylactic cholecystectomy is a good risk in a good risk patient. Thickened gallbladder wall, interval increases in the size of polyp are indications. So as we monitor polyp size or prophylactic cholecystectomy in the setting of gallstone disease. Pipiotic malfunction, prophylactic cholecystectomy with extra hepatic bile duct resection if there is a dilated bile duct, like we do. So these are the people where gallbladder surgery is required. So summarizing, is prophylactic cholecystectomy justified in area with high incidence of high prevalence area? So routine prophylactic cholecystectomy is not justified. Patients with high risk factors should be offered surgery that to a level 3 evidence and grade C recommendation. Scenario 3, you are the final year SR and the first year SR has shifted the patient who are elective laparoscopy cholecystectomy. During the time of the anesthetist asked if any antibiotic is needed. Please, my friends who are giving antibiotic history for 7 days, see this. He calls for advice. And what answer he should give? Meaning thereby, question is that are perioperative antibiotics indicated in patients with uncomplicated gallstone disease? So 9 RCT, 1,437 patients. No reduction in the infection with the use of prophylactic antibiotic. We are not talking of therapy. 15 trials, so many patients. No reduction in the infection without prophylactic antibiotics in low risk patients. Low risk patients. So prophylactic antibiotics reduce infections and therefore healthcare cost in laparoscopic cholecystectomy. RCT from Japan were 500 patients in each. This is another trial. So summarizing the same, is perioperative antibiotic indicated in patients with uncomplicated gallstone disease? Not a routine indication in uncomplicated laparoscopic cholecystectomy, level 1 evidence, grade 3 recommendation. A new meta-analysis including the recent Japanese RCT might give a different answer. But till get this one. Scenario 4. A young woman of 20 years presents with acute cholecystitis. This is another very area which is discussed repeatedly. She had been symptomatic of 4 days. The consultant asked me to post her right away for laparoscopic cholecystectomy, and patient asked if it would be okay to wait for 6 weeks. Everybody is saying that now. What would be your advice? So, meaning thereby, what is the best time to operate a patient in a case of acute cholecystitis? All our agent, please see the level. The meta-analysis of this RCT is involving about 500 patients. So early 0.4%, delay, but please remember that is less than 7 days. Early doesn't mean 15 days, less than 7 days. Conversion was 19.7%, delayed conversion has been 22.1% and 0.9%. So it is little bit more, both. So no difference in the operative time, no difference in other complications, no pancreatitis, no mortality, start of hospital is in early group. That is very, very important. And you can see the evidence. So updated meta-analysis, you see this bilateral injury. Again, you can see the same result. Similar morbidity and conversion. Lower cost, lower rate of wound infection. So meaning thereby, what is the message? Message is there is a clear evidence to suggest that early cholecystectomy, less than 7 days, is safe, results in good outcomes with short hospitalization and cost of operation in acute cholecystitis. So that is what is level 1 evidence and grade A recommendation. And there are few more slides, but I will end here because these are the 3 very important areas where I wanted everybody to know. And thanks. If yes, sir. Yes, sir. Oh, I am thinking because of the. Yeah. Should I complete? Yeah. Okay. A 50-year-old man with no comorbidity presents with symptomatic gallstones and CVD stone to the emergency. He had pain, total bilirubin of 3 milligrams per but no cholesterol. The GSR wants to post him for ERC and he told remember, you are contemplating laparoscopy, cholecystectomy and CVD exploration. Laparoscopically, the patient hears the conversation and confused. How do you reassure? What is the best approach in a patient with gallstone CVD stone? So, sorry, about 12 trials, this number of patients, no difference in successful duct clearance, morbidity or need for other procedure. Similar outcomes, treatment should be determined by the local resource and obviously expert type. So, if you are expert, you have a local resource of having cholecystoscope, having intraoperative angiogram, you can do everything, you are expert, then there is no difference in the outcome. My friend would be coming next, he will give some reports to us. So 16 trials, see the trials, number of trials, you see, ERC, pre and post-op PRC, intra PRC, no difference in the morbidity and retained stones. So again, this is the, what is the best approach in a patient with the gallstone and CVD stones? A single stage laparoscopic cholecystectomy and CVD exploration is as good as pre or post-operative or pre-operative ERC followed by laparoscopic cholecystectomy and shorten the hospital stay and reduces the cost. Scenario 6. A young woman wants minimal scarring and preferably a scarless cholecystectomy as cyst is coming, everybody talks of cyst. She is due to get married next month. She inquires about cyst nodes. What should be one's advice? Is cyst nodes better than conventional laparoscopic cholecystectomy? Is it really safe? So, 90 patient RCT, no significant difference in long-term outcome or short-term morbidity. Longer operative time in cyst, but lesser analgesic requirement, no particular advantage of the cyst. So people who prefer cyst, I am totally against, but this is what is the evidence. 13 RCT, 9 to 3 procedure, cyst, higher failure rate, longer operative time, more bleeding, not different in adverse effects, but better prognosis, not adequately powered to detect the safety. This last line is so important. So similar these are the other evidences. Mini laparoscopy, that is the shortening the size of the, decreasing the size of the pores definitely had shown to be a better cosmetic outcome, nothing else. These are the same. So hybrid nodes cholecystectomy has resulted in lesser pain, better cosmesis, because I think better short-term in quality of life in the recent RCT. So 14 study, more than about 1,145 patients, no difference in the incidence of complication and bile duct injury, post-operative pain and time to return to normal activity were better in the hybrid nodes. And then I immediately come to the recommendation. This is results in better cosmesis, not enough data to say that it is safe. And conventional safer than conventional laparoscopy. Cholecystectomy, hybrid node definitely is a procedure are as effective as conventional procedure, but have better cosmesis, have not found wide acceptance. We don't know the reason. And thank you all. I wish Dr. Kishore would have been here. I don't want to take any credit for this slide preparation. And sir, please.
A nice presentation. Statistics is a wonderful branch. You get a statistician and you give a boiling water bucket to him on one hand and a cold water bucket, and you tell him to put his hands into the buckets and you ask him, how do you feel? So he'll say, on the whole, I feel very fine. Statistics is also...
English is the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Language English is also the same, they are using it.
And statistics is also like a bikini. What it reveals is very interesting, but what it conceals is nonetheless interesting, right? So it's a game of words and numericals. It is very, very important for us to have a very deep knowledge of statistics. Like you said, evidence-based medicine, it's a berry picking, as I feel, but because at any one given moment, it's impossible to have access to all that evidence, not the abstracts I'm talking. Abstracts तो एकदम से मिल जाएंगे, आप Google करोगे तो abstracts मिल जाएंगे. But that is not the actual evidence. If I have to, sitting in Jalandhar, if I need to study evidence, how do I get it? I mean, it's impossible to get all the evidence on one particular practice, and therefore I would do what works best in my hands. Is that wrong?
No. Just I take your point. See, what makes is by hand is a very subjective, and science doesn't believe subjective things, is it? Science has to evolve with the time. If you don't believe in these data, evidence, then where will go? Science will go. That is the important message. You have to do what you are feeling the best, but what you are feeling the best might not be the best. So that's why you have to have the evidence.
There was a couple of issues before the British General Surgery had come up with a complete issue on this was surgery in third world countries or something, and it was validated that a mosquito net, I mean this is off the this forum, mosquito net works as good as a polypropylene mesh for repair of hernia. This has been put into record by British General Surgery. You see, there's evidence, but I will not take that evidence. I will not start using mosquito nets in place of Prolene mesh. It's in British Journal of Surgery. So it's very, very important to really sieve that evidence.
See, that individualized medicine is all right, but
we got the point. Can you proceed further? Any other question on this particular talk? If there is none, we go to the next one.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you, TD. Dr. S.K. Sinha, he is the additional professor at the Department of Gastroenterology. He is going to talk about the endoscopic approach to the biliary duct.
So, Dr. Yadav was talking about the love-hate relationships which surgeons always have with repeating endoscopies. You cannot live with them, but you also, it's fact that you cannot live without them. Without them. So what happens? This is the typical example in a scenario. Portal biliopathy, what the term has been used in the process. That here, this is the typical condition where the surgeons and the therapeutic endoscopy need to work together very closely with a close interaction if satisfactory outcome is required. People have been talking what is in the name, but there is something in the name, and this is what in Asal felt that now it is time to change the terminology from portal hypertensive biliopathy to portal cavernoma cholineopathy. So this is the consensus which got published last year. The conference was held in 2012, And now the consensus statement is this should be termed portal cavernoma cholangiopathy. So I'm going to use PCC word all throughout my talk rather than PHP. So basically PCC refers to abnormalities in extrahepatic biliary system, including cystic duct, gallbladder, with and without abnormalities in the first and second. So mind it, these changes will occur up to the second generation biliary duct, intrahepatic biliary duct. And the diagnostic criteria involves all the three criteria should be fulfilled: presence of cavernoma, typical cholangiographic changes, and there should not be other causes like PSC and cholangiocarcinoma. So what are the cholangiographic abnormalities? So this is extrinsic impression, or each parameter has a different definition. So silo impression less than 25% compromise in the caliber. Then more than 25% compromise is extrinsic impression. Then irregular contour. Series of them will result into irregular contour. Then stenosis, meaning thereby that causing obstruction to the bile flow. This we recognize by two methods. One is by when pulling the balloon through the bile duct, if there is obstruction, or if there is upstream dilatation, and that defines the stenosis. Then we have a filling defect, and filling defect we define by the contrast column being filled three sides of the filling defect. Then angulation, if there is less than 145 degree between the lower and upper cavity, and then ectasia, this refers to dilatation without obstruction, in contrast to stenosis. So if there is obstruction and dilatation, this will be defined as stenosis, otherwise this is ectasia. So there is different patterns described. So this is type 1 involves extrahepatic, then type 2 intrahepatic, type 3A, this is involvement of one side duct and then involvement of the both side duct, type 3B. And then we have severity of PCC, grade 1 irregularity just, so this will be asymptomatic, then indentation without upstream dilatation, few symptomatic but mostly asymptomatic, and then grade 3 will have strictures. And when we talk of dilatation, this is the cutoff which has been suggested. For extrahepatic duct 7 mm and for intrahepatic 4 mm. So that should be the cutoff which should be practiced. So there should be uniformity among the different groups working in the field. So that is very important to use the precise criteria. And there are different stages of portal cavernoma cholangiopathy. Preclinical, we all know that. Almost no consequence, just a clinical, one needs to be aware. Most of the patients, actually 90%, almost 80-90% patients will remain asymptomatic. These are the early changes, everything remains normal. In the symptomatic, there will be advanced changes like stage 3 changes which I mentioned previously, and abnormalities start coming, and then complicated by strictures, stones, CVD stones, gallbladder stones and other things. The location is very important. Like extrahepatic tree is more commonly involved, and in intrahepatic, typically the left ductal system, the left hepatic duct is most commonly involved. This is almost across all studies, including our own studies from the PGI. And then the right ductal system is involved slightly less frequently, and then we have CVD strictures. So if we see prevalence, asymptomatic involvement is virtually the asymptomatic involvement is virtually a rule rather than exception. So virtually almost 80 to 100% of the patients will have the changes. I am talking of extrahepatic portal vein obstruction or portal vein thrombosis chronic. But only very small percentage of the patient, on the average, if you take mean, just 19% of them will be symptomatic in the form of a left abnormality or symptoms. So that is the scenario, but this is our own study. So just moving beyond EHPVO, like 19% or 20% patients are symptomatic and they will have intrahepatic bile duct changes. We also looked into non-EHPVO situation like cirrhosis and NCPA. Like current terminology will not let you, PCC will not be used. So again, I have shifted back to older terminology of portal hypertensive biliopathy. So they are also occasionally they are also known to have a similar changes by the similar pathway mechanism of action, and although uncommon or rare. So we all of this is not the forum to teach anatomy for the biliary, but we need to be aware if we have to deal with it very meticulously. So both the arterial system and the venous system will be in the similar pathway. And what we have in the venous system is two plexus. One is epicholedocal and then paracholedocal. And what happens that the two from the side, we have the marginal veins, and that goes on to join. As a therapeutic endoscopist, I have to take care of, I have to be aware that I will come subsequently when I am showing the US data, that this is very important for us when we are handling the patient. And what happens that ultimately when thrombosis actually occurs, these channels dilate and they are responsible for portal hypertensive biliopathy or portal cavernoma cholangiopathy. So this is what actually happens, that these channels dilate, they compress the biliary system, and sometimes because of ischemia, strictures also develop, so those will not reverse completely. So the changes can be picked up, at least suspected on ultrasound, not well picked up on transabdominal ultrasound, but MRCP with MR photovenography and contrast MR, this is the optimum investigation as of now to diagnose, and that has been recommended in the nasal consensus conference. Because ERCP is invasive, it carries certain amount of risk, so as of now we are not using ERCP for the diagnostic purposes in this situation, but that should be completely replaced by the MRCP with MR photovenography. So that will give adequate visualization of everything what I have just described, that pattern of the involvement can be seen, the severity of the involvement can be seen, and the exact treatment planning can be required, and ERCP should be done only for the repeated purposes. So MRCP as well as ERCP we can make out the changes very clearly, and detailed analysis can be done, and the treatment planning can be done. So this is the typical ERCP appearance, where we have cantilever irregularity, all these are filling defects, the criteria is more than 3/4 of the circumference, there should be contrast, and we see here all around. This can be mistaken for a stone disease, but MRCP will have superiority over ERCP, because MRCP can distinguish whether these are the choledochal varices or whether these are stones. In place of MRCP, sometimes now we use actually endoscopic ultrasound to distinguish, and we base our decision on endoscopic ultrasound, which has possibly better reliability than even MRCP for distinction purposes, and we can do treatment planning in that. Again, these are appear like stones, but these are actually, this is one of my own case, and this was actually choledochal varices. So as mentioned already, most patients are actually asymptomatic, and symptoms will be seen in a small percentage of patients. But most important, cholangitis can be an important problem in this patient, and the factors which determine the symptomatic, like as the duration of the disease goes on, become longer, more likely to be symptomatic, and if we have gap dilatation or associated gallstone or CVD stone. But the cholangitis is seen in disproportionately higher percentage of the patient compared to other forms of biliary obstruction, and this can be seen in virtually more than half of the patients of portal biliopathy. So that's why the endoscopists have to come into the picture and for the management of that, because it will be improper to subject these patients with the ongoing cholangitis for surgery. So if we see distinguish between the asymptomatic and symptomatic, these are the parameters which actually duration of the disease, and then bilirubin, and then we have alkaline phosphatase level coming up. These are the parameters which we use to distinguish between the diseases. If we see frequency, this is the data, summarized data from different series of gallbladder and biliary calculi. So if we see the prevalence is around gallbladder stones around 13%, range varying from 0 to 69%, and then prevalence of CVD stone in this scenario is 17%, overall varying from 0 to 77%. So the treatment part, this has to be a staged approach. Stage 1 is the bile duct clearance either by ERCP or surgically, whatever means we talk. As of now, possibly if there is CVD stone, then possibly by ERCP, and subsequently total decompression. This will mean most of the time this will mean a shunt, and if there is a shuntable vein, and to 90%. The rest of the patients either due to technical failure or there will not a shuntable vein, so will not be subjected. And subsequent to that, patient will be considered for bilio and trip drainage if there is persistent biliary obstruction. This is very important because a large percentage of the patient will actually improve with shunt only, and then nothing more will be required. So this is the flow chart which has been suggested by Inasal, that okay, if assess the patients of ESPBO with that, if PCC is present, LFT is normal, nothing to be done, and only absent, then again nothing to be done, and if there is biliary obstruction, then we need to intervene. If there is CVD stone, endoscopic treatment has been suggested, possibly acceptable to everybody, and if there is choledochal stenosis, then we can discuss, but possibly endoscopic treatment can be tried. But in other scenario, the shunt should be considered. So indications of ERCP in the setting in this scenario is before photosystemic shunt. If there is cholangitis, cholangitic abscesses, for only jaundice or cholestasis, this can be debated. Or if there is no shuntable vein, then for a definitive therapy can be taken for ERCP. Perioperative, if there is jaundice with cholangitis, only then after photosystemic, some of the patients have persistent obstruction despite patent shunt, and they can be subjected. Otherwise, if the shunt fails or if there is blockage of shunt. Lots of data has come, but mostly small series. These are the initial series of 4 patients and 10 patients, and subsequently there is better series, larger series of 14 and 20 patients. This is relatively recent data, and very complicated course for endoscopy is not an easy path. Multiple sessions are required, lots of cholangitis, risk of bleeding. So overall, these patients need to be managed by like a biliary strictures, by benign biliary strictures. So that will require putting multiple plastic stents, multi-session ERCP, scheduled changes of biliary stent at the interval of 2 to 3 months, and stenting over a period of 1 to 3 years, and there will be risk of hemophilia, cholangitis, cause issues related to long-term follow-up. There are problems like bleeding occurs during the procedure slightly higher than the other patients, and many of them are self-limiting, but we have measures like adrenaline injection, coagulation, and argon plasma coagulation, and the things which we use and mostly successful. Sometimes medical therapy is done with terlipressin. Occasional patients where there is potential bleeding, self-expanding metal stent is placed to control that bleeding. Cholangitis occurs during in between the periods of stent change, elective stent change, particularly when the patient misses out on follow-up, and sometimes there is early blockage of stent. Normally 6 months is the time when we try to change the stent, sometimes in between blockage occurs. So ACMS, some data is coming for a stricture management, but too early to draw any conclusion. So typical scenario, this is not the scenario where we will be doing stenting without a sphincterotomy, because stenting in this scenario almost always means putting 2 or 3 stents minimum. Our target is always to achieve at least 10 stents into 3, so 30 French size for the resolution of obstruction, which has to be kept for almost minimum 1 year period for tackling the ST. There is always risk of bleeding, so we have US expertise available now, and this can be used very comfortably for the clinical decision. So what we do in US can be done if it shows paracolloidal or pericolloidal collaterals or extracolloidal collaterals. Not much of issues. ERCP can be done safely and confidently, no issues. But if it shows perforators, if there are subepithelial varices, and if there are intracolloidal varices, then one has to be very cautious that during ERCP we are going to expect some amount of bleeding and complication. we can give early pressing beforehand, but we have to be ready, we have to take high risk consent, and we have to ready with a full armamentarium. And there are some reports of using induced hypotension during the procedure to prevent bleeding. So that is technology is coming for help. So this is to summarize that cholangitis is common in PCC, the current terminology is PCC, and cholangitis is common. Endoscopic therapy is required in quite a good percentage of the patient, and shunt is the mainstay of therapy. If it is feasible, there is shuntable vein. ERCP results in the resolution of symptoms in the short term, but long term success is only modest and requires multiple sessions. Surgical treatment, shunt is the mainstay, and some of the patients will require ultimately biliary treatment.
Comments, questions? Anil? Okay, Ramesh.
I have a large series of patients where we have done shunts. They come back after 10 years, 12 years after shunt with this condition, portal VOP. Then what is your?
So that's why I was talking in the later part, didn't emphasize that much, that if there is shunt failure can happen for different reasons, like in blockage or other reasons. Then ultimately, or if that becomes a similar situation where there is no shuntable vein, then ultimately patient has to be managed by endoscopy, and that means putting up multiple as of now, not a CMS, till the more data becomes available. And we generally try to achieve, in the first go we place a minimum 10 French, if possible from the word go we try to put multiple stents. And our target is 27 to 30 French in the pilot. That means putting 3 stents, 10 French 3 stents or 2 10 French and 1 7 French stent in the bile keep at that level minimum 1 year. And then we try to remove and follow the patient. If patient does fine, most of 2/3, 3/4 patients tend to do well with that.
I must say I like and appreciate your optimism that there may be some problem, some bleeding. I think this is the nightmare as far as surgeons are concerned, operating on these cases with collateralization and portal veins around the CVD. If bleeding occurs, then what?
Just now we had session for evidence-based medicine, and what IMASL came out with the data, this is not very old data, 2014 paper, the meeting was held in 2012 end, and they came with a class 1 grade A recommendation, strong recommendation, that ERCP, the risk of bleeding is not much. So, having worked in the area for that many years and having a pretty large experience on handling this situation, I know this data is not correct. Why this data is not correct? Because what endoscopists, everybody, endoscopists, I believe surgeon as well, that we have a tendency to under-report the complications. So what happens that everybody in the national scenario, I have opportunity to talk more than half a dozen people who had torrential, who faced with the torrential hemorrhage during the ERCP. But if I search literature last night, there is hardly anything published. Just one case report of using ACMS for torrential hemorrhage successfully. But I am aware of some of the patients who died of torrential hemorrhage because many of the endoscopy labs will not have available ACMS available off the shelf to be used at the drop of a hat. So that is the point. So recommendation also.
I think the point I wanted you to emphasize is that even in a situation like this, without surgery, when you do endoscopic TPT and other procedures, you are controlling as much as possible the portal hypertension part of the disease.
Sir, I am coming to that. So meaning thereby that portal hypertensive biliopathy or PCC therapeutic endoscopy in that scenario is not everybody's piece of cake. You have to have full armamentarium of hemostasis available at your hand. at the drop of the hat. So ranging from organ plasma coagulation, early present, induced hypotension and ACMS should be available in the lab, only this should be done. So this should be not taken like at routine biliary instrument. This will be pretty dangerous.
In spite of that, trouble may not be over.
Yeah,
Still
definitely,
bleeding, then?
definitely. And then you need a
Surgeon.
surgical friend like Dr. Yadav, Dr. Rajesh. Should be ready to for the rescue.
Don't call them at midnight. Please tell them in the morning itself that you are taking up a case and there may be a problem.
Most of the time we are working on elective basis, so that should not be an issue.
In that context, I have to just mention this often in the context of physiopathy. We talk about epicolitical and pericolitical medicines. We forget interductal. I had the misfortune of almost losing a patient by removing a stone from inside the organ and started bleeding. I don't know what to do. Luckily for me, that I inserted a thick bore T-tube and that compressed and saved me.
I am working in this area for more than a decade, I will say, and I will say that the most important slide which I showed actually is the use
I
of
noted
US.
that initially you mentioned that these are not stones.
Use of US in the management of that. This is the most significant development which has happened.
The case I am referring to had a stone. I had to remove the stone. I did this stone. They happened to be father of my own colleague here in the department.
Basically, this is high volume but low pressure. So if you have patients, just press it, compress it and wait, it would stop.
It didn't. Sorry to put it into context.
That's another thing.
So when I think the point well taken. It is a difficult area, it is a difficult intervention, whether endoscopic or surgical, and I think you have to be fully prepared for it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We go to the next speaker.